The lawyer's office smelled like old leather and disappointment. I sat across from Mr. Henderson, my hands clasped tightly in my lap, trying to prepare myself for what I already suspected. Dad had been gone 3 months, Mom just 2 weeks after him. Their hearts gave out within months of each other, like they couldn't bear to be apart. "Sarah," Mr. Henderson began, adjusting his glasses, "your parents' will is quite straightforward." I nodded, glancing at my brother Jake beside me. He wore his best shirt, the one he saved for church and funerals. His calloused hands rested confidently on his knees. The ranch, all 200 acres, along with the house, barn, and equipment, goes to Jake. The words hit me like a physical blow, even though I'd seen this coming. 28 years I'd worked that land alongside Dad. I knew every fence post, every seasonal rhythm, every challenge that came with drought or flood. But Jake was the son, the heir apparent, the one who'd stayed close to home. "To Sarah," the lawyer continued, "they've left their savings account, approximately $15,000. $15,000. The cost of a decent used truck." I felt my chest tighten, but I kept my expression neutral. Jake reached over and squeezed my shoulder. "Sarah, you know you'll always have a place at the ranch," he said softly. I managed a smile. "Thanks, Jake." But inside, something had shifted. As we walked out into the harsh afternoon sun, I realized I wasn't just losing my inheritance. I was losing my identity, my future, everything I thought I'd spend my life building. The ranch was my home, but it was no longer mine. Growing up, the difference in how our parents treated Jake and me was subtle but constant. He was 2 years older, born into the role of future rancher before he could even walk. I learned to rope calves and mend fences right beside him, but somehow my efforts were always seen as helping rather than leading. "Jake's got the ranch sense," Dad would say, watching us work. "Born to this land." When I suggested improvements or questioned outdated methods, Dad would nod politely, but inevitably turn to Jake for the final decision. It wasn't malicious, just ingrained. Sons inherited land. Daughters married and moved away. Even in the 21st century, our family held tight to old traditions. I'd accepted it, mostly. I loved the work too much to fight the system. Feeding cattle at dawn, watching storms roll across endless pastures, feeling connected to something bigger than myself. This was my calling, inheritance or not. But sitting in that lawyer's office, the reality crashed over me. I'd spent my entire adult life building someone else's dream. Every fence I'd mended, every improvement I'd suggested and implemented, every sleepless night during calving season, it was all Jake's now. Jake was a good rancher, don't get me wrong. He worked hard and loved the land, but he'd always known it would be his. He'd made plans, taken risks, borrowed against future ownership. He'd even started dating Martha Stewart, not the famous one, but the local bank president's daughter, with an eye toward expanding operations. I'd never allowed myself those same luxuries of certainty. I'd lived as a permanent guest in my own life, and now the invitation had expired. That night, alone in my childhood bedroom, I stared at the ceiling and made a decision that would change everything. I couldn't sleep, so I did what I always do when faced with a problem. I researched. My laptop glowed in the dark bedroom as I searched real estate listings, agricultural reports, and bank websites. If I couldn't inherit the family land, maybe I could create my own legacy. The Hendricks farm next door had been for sale for 6 months. Old Bill Hendricks had moved to assisted living after his wife passed, and his children lived in the city with no interest in farming. The property was smaller than our family ranch, just 80 acres, but it included a modest farmhouse, a decent barn, and good soil. The asking price was $58,000. I had $15,000 from the inheritance, plus about $12,000 in my personal savings. $27,000 total. I needed more than double that amount, and my credit history was decent, but not spectacular. Most of my employment history showed working for my family's ranch, which looked good on paper but didn't provide the stable paycheck history banks preferred. I spent hours researching agricultural loans, first-time buyer programs, and rural development grants. The USDA offered loans for beginning farmers, but the application process was lengthy and competitive. I'd need a solid business plan, cash flow projections, and proof of farming experience. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had decades of experience, but couldn't prove it with pay stubs or performance reviews. I was an expert rancher with no official credentials, a lifelong farmer with no land to show for it. But I'd grown up solving problems with determination and creativity. Cattle got loose, you found a way to bring them home. Equipment broke down during harvest. You fixed it with whatever materials you had. This was just another problem to solve. By dawn, I had the framework of a plan. It was ambitious and risky, but it was mine. The next morning, I sat at the kitchen table with coffee and a notebook, sketching out my strategy. Jake was already in the fields, checking on the herd. The house felt different now. Less like home, more like borrowed space. My plan had 3 phases. First, secure financing for the Hendricks place. Second, establish my own agricultural operation. Third, prove that the daughter could succeed just as well as the son, right next door where everyone could see. I started with a visit to First National Bank, where Martha Stewart's father held court as president. Thomas Stewart was a practical man who'd known our family for decades. He listened patiently as I explained my situation and my intentions. "Sarah, you're talking about a significant financial commitment," he said, leaning back in his leather chair. "Farming next door to your family's ranch, that could create complications. Or opportunities," I replied. "I know this land better than anyone. I understand the climate, the soil conditions, the local market. I've been managing operations at our ranch for years." He nodded thoughtfully. "Your credit is solid, but you'll need to put down at least 20%. That's about $12,000, plus closing costs, inspection, survey. You're looking at $15,000 to $16,000 up front." I had the money, barely. "What about the remaining balance?" "We can structure it as an agricultural loan, but you'll need a business plan. Revenue projections, marketing strategy, the works, and you'll need to show how you'll make payments while establishing your operation." I left the bank with a loan application and a deadline. I had 30 days to prove I deserved this chance. That afternoon, I drove slowly past the Hendricks place, imagining it as mine. The farmhouse needed work, but the bones were solid. The pastures were overgrown but fertile. The barn was smaller than what I was used to, but adequate for starting out. This could work. This would work. Creating a business plan forced me to confront the reality of starting over at 30. I had experience but no capital beyond my small savings. I had knowledge but no established customer base. I had passion but no safety net. I decided to focus on what I knew best: cattle ranching, but with a modern twist. Instead of traditional beef production, I'd raise grass-fed, organic cattle for the growing premium market. The initial herd would be small, maybe 20 head, but the profit margins were better than conventional ranching. I also planned to diversify with a large vegetable garden and a farm stand. The highway that ran past the Hendricks place saw decent traffic from tourists heading to the lake. Fresh produce, eggs from a small chicken flock, maybe some baked goods. It wouldn't make me rich, but it would provide steady income while the cattle operation established itself. The numbers were tight. Very tight. I projected breaking even in year 2, with modest profits in year 3. It wasn't the most conservative business plan ever written, but it was realistic based on my research and experience. I spent evenings at the library, using their computer and printer to format everything professionally. I researched comparable operations, analyzed market trends, and created detailed financial projections. My plan grew to 37 pages of carefully researched optimism. The hardest part was writing the personal statement explaining why I deserved this loan. How do you summarize a lifetime of unrecognized expertise? How do you prove your worth when your own family hadn't seen fit to invest in your future? I wrote about understanding the land, about innovation within tradition, about proving that success comes from dedication rather than inheritance. I wrote about dreams deferred but not abandoned. When I finally submitted the application, my hands were shaking. The loan application sat in review for 3 weeks that felt like 3 years. I continued working at the family ranch, now Jake's ranch, trying to act normal while my entire future hung in the balance. Jake sensed something was different but didn't push when I deflected his questions. Martha Stewart, Jake's Martha, not the celebrity, started spending more time at the ranch. She was nice enough, with a head for business that complemented Jake's practical nature. They made sense together in a way that highlighted my own isolation. At 30, I'd never had a serious relationship. The ranch had been my whole life, leaving little time or energy for romance. Watching them plan their future together in what had been my family home stirred emotions I hadn't expected. Not jealousy, exactly, but a profound sense of displacement. They belonged here in a way I apparently never had. 2 weeks into the wait, I couldn't stand the uncertainty anymore. I called Thomas Stewart directly. "These things take time, Sarah," he said kindly. "The loan committee meets monthly, and they're being thorough. Is there anything else I can provide? References? Additional documentation?" "Actually, yes. They'd like to see a letter of recommendation from someone who can speak to your agricultural experience." My heart sank. The most obvious choice was Dad, but he was gone. Jake would write me a glowing recommendation, but that felt like admitting defeat, asking my younger brother's permission to chase my dreams. Then I remembered Bill Hendricks himself. Before his wife's illness, he'd been one of the most respected farmers in the county. He knew my work, had often praised my innovations when he'd visited our ranch. If anyone could vouch for my capabilities, it was the man whose land I hoped to buy. I drove to Sunset Manor that afternoon, nervous but determined to ask for his help. Sunset Manor smelled like disinfectant and cafeteria food, but Bill Hendricks's room was bright with afternoon sunlight and family photos. At 78, he was still sharp, his eyes lighting up when I explained my situation. "Sarah Mitchell, buying my place?" He chuckled and shook his head. "Your daddy would be proud and worried in equal measure." "Worried?" "Starting out on your own, especially right next door to family land. That's going to create interesting dynamics." He studied my face carefully. "But if anyone can make it work, it's you. I've watched you manage that ranch for years. You've got the touch." He agreed to write the recommendation letter immediately, dictating it while I typed on his old computer. His words were generous and specific, detailing projects I'd led and innovations I'd implemented. Reading his assessment of my abilities, I felt something I hadn't experienced in the lawyer's office: validation. "The land's been good to me for 50 years, he said as I prepared to leave. "I hope it'll be good to you too. The soil in the south pasture is the richest you'll find in the county. The well's deep and reliable. The only thing wrong with that place is it's been empty too long." Driving home, I felt hopeful for the first time since my parents died. Maybe this wasn't just about proving something to my family or the community. Maybe it was about proving something to myself. The next morning, I submitted Bill's letter to the bank. Thomas Stewart called that afternoon. "Good news, Sarah. The loan committee approved your application. You can pick up the paperwork tomorrow." I hung up the phone and stared out the window at the Hendricks place. My place now, once the paperwork was signed. After 30 years of working someone else's dream, I was about to start building my own. Closing day arrived with unseasonable warmth for October. I sat at the conference table in the lawyer's office, signing paper after paper that would tie me to this land and this debt for the next 20 years. My hands were steady, but my heart raced with each signature. The seller's attorney represented Bill Hendricks's interests, while I'd hired a young lawyer from the county seat to review the contract. Jake had offered to come along for moral support, but I needed to do this alone. This was my leap of faith. "Congratulations, Ms. Mitchell," the attorney said, sliding the keys across the table. "You're now the proud owner of 80 acres in Jefferson County." 80 acres. It sounded smaller when spoken aloud than it had in my dreams, but it was mine. Every fence post, every blade of grass, every sunrise over those fields belonged to me now. I drove straight to the property, my property, and walked the fence line I'd admired from a distance for years. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across pastures that would soon hold my cattle. The farmhouse was modest but solid, with good bones and plenty of potential. Standing in what would be my kitchen, looking out the window toward the ranch where I'd grown up, I felt a complex mix of emotion. Sadness for the family traditions I'd left behind, excitement for the future I was creating, and something else, a fierce determination to prove that this leap of faith would pay. That evening, I called Jake to tell him the news. There was a long pause after I explained what I'd done. "Sarah, that's incredible," he finally said. "I mean, it's crazy, but incredible. Why didn't you tell me you were thinking about this? I needed to know I could do it myself. You realize this changes things between us, right? We're going to be neighbors, but also competitors. I hope we can be both." The first night in my new house was the loneliest of my life. I'd moved my bedroom furniture and essential belongings, but the place echoed with emptiness. Every sound seemed amplified. The settling of old wood, the whistle of wind through gaps around windows, the distant lowing of cattle from Jake's ranch. I'd grown up surrounded by family, even if I hadn't always felt fully included in their plans. Now I was truly alone for the first time, responsible for every decision and every consequence. The weight of it was both terrifying and liberating. My first priority was making the house livable while staying within my tight budget. I spent weekends patching walls, painting rooms with discount paint, and fixing leaky faucets myself. YouTube became my best friend as I learned skills I'd never needed at the family ranch, where Jake or Dad had handled most household repairs. The physical work was therapeutic. Each improvement made the house feel more like mine, less like temporary shelter. I painted the kitchen yellow, a color my mother would have called impractical, and hung curtains I'd sewn myself in the front windows. Gradually, neighbors began stopping by. Word had spread quickly in our small community about the Mitchell girl buying the Hendricks place. Some visits were genuine offers of help. Others felt more like reconnaissance missions to assess my chances of success. Mrs. Patterson from down the road brought homemade bread and stayed for coffee. "Your mother was so proud of your work ethic," she said. "She used to brag about how you could outwork most men twice your size." It was the first I'd heard of Mom bragging about me, and the comment brought unexpected tears. Maybe my parents had seen my contributions more clearly than I'd realized. Maybe their decision to leave the ranch to Jake had been about tradition rather than merit. The thought was both comforting and infuriating. Spring arrived early, and with it came the real work of building my agricultural operation. I'd spent the winter months planning, researching, and slowly acquiring equipment at farm auctions. My budget couldn't handle new machinery, but I was skilled at evaluating used equipment and making repairs. My first major purchase was a small tractor, a 20-year-old Ford that needed engine work but was structurally sound. I spent 3 weeks in the barn, rebuilding the motor with parts ordered online and tools borrowed from Jake. Working alone in the quiet barn, covered in grease and utterly focused on the mechanical puzzle, I felt more content than I had in months. The cattle came next. 15 bred cows and 1 young bull, all registered organic stock that cost more per head than conventional cattle but would command premium prices. I arranged to buy them from a farm 3 counties over, partly for the better genetics, and partly because I wanted to establish my independence from local suppliers who might see me as Jake's little sister playing farmer. Loading those cattle into my borrowed trailer and driving them home was one of the most satisfying moments of my life. They were mine. My investment, my risk, my future walking on 4 legs. I spent hours each day working with them, getting them accustomed to their new home and to my management style. Cattle are creatures of habit, and these animals needed time to trust their new owner. I talked to them while filling water tanks and checking fences, explaining my plans as if they could understand my ambitions. Jake stopped by regularly, ostensibly to check on my progress, but really to make sure I wasn't in over my head. His visits were a mixture of brotherly concern and professional curiosity. He was impressed despite himself, which felt like a small victory. Success in farming is measured by how well you handle disasters, and mine came in late May. A violent thunderstorm brought hail the size of golf balls and winds that knocked out power lines and damaged buildings throughout the county. I woke to the sound of metal roofing being peeled off my barn. In the gray dawn light, I surveyed the damage with a sinking heart. Half the barn roof was gone, scattered across the pasture in twisted sheets. The chicken coop I'd built was completely destroyed, its occupants huddled miserably in the debris. 3 sections of fence were down, and my cattle had wandered into the road. This was the test I'd known was coming but hoped to avoid. A crisis that would strain both my resources and my resolve. I had insurance, but it wouldn't cover everything, and the deductible would eat into my carefully planned budget. I spent the morning rounding up cattle and making temporary repairs to keep everyone safe. By afternoon, Jake appeared with his truck and trailer, ready to help without being asked. We worked side by side in companionable silence, fixing fence and moving debris. "Insurance adjuster coming tomorrow?" he asked as we secured a tarp over the damaged roof. "Thursday. But I already know this is going to hurt financially." "You need help, you ask. I mean it, Sarah. We're neighbors now, but we're still family." That evening, sitting on my front porch and looking at the destruction, I felt discouraged for the first time since buying the place. Farming was always a gamble against weather, market prices, and unforeseen circumstances. But when you're starting with minimal capital, even small disasters can become existential threats. I could ask Jake for help, or even sell out and return to working for him. The thought was tempting in my exhaustion, but it lasted only a moment. I'd bought this place to prove something to myself as much as anyone else. This setback was just part of the story I was determined to write. The insurance settlement covered about 60% of the storm damage, leaving me with a $5,000 gap to bridge. I took out a small personal loan and spent the summer rebuilding, learning skills I'd never needed and discovering reserves of determination I hadn't known I possessed. The new barn roof was smaller but more efficient than the old one. I redesigned the hayloft for better ventilation and installed LED lighting that would reduce electricity costs. Every improvement was carefully considered for both immediate needs and long-term efficiency. My vegetable operation exceeded expectations. The farm stand I'd built near the road attracted steady customers, especially on weekends when lake traffic was heavy. Fresh corn, tomatoes, squash, and herbs provided consistent income throughout the summer. I added eggs from my rebuilt chicken flock and homemade preserves made from fruit trees that came with the property. By August, I was actually showing a small profit, something my business plan hadn't projected until year 2. The organic beef operation was still developing, but early indicators suggested strong demand for locally raised grass-fed cattle. I'd already received inquiries from restaurants in the county seat about regular supply contracts. More importantly, I felt established. The house was truly home now, reflecting my preferences rather than inherited decorating choice. The land responded to my management style, which emphasized sustainability and soil health over maximum short-term yields. I was building something that would improve over time rather than depleting resources for quick profits. Jake and Martha visited regularly, often bringing friends who were curious about my operation. Their support meant everything, especially as our parents' absence became less acute but more permanent. We were creating new family traditions while honoring the old ones. The satisfaction I felt watching my cattle graze contentedly in pastures I owned was worth every sleepless night and financial worry. The county extension office featured my farm in their fall newsletter, highlighting my innovative approach to small-scale organic ranching. The article praised my diversified operation and my rapid establishment as a local food producer. Seeing my name in print as a successful farmer, rather than someone's daughter or employee, felt like official recognition of what I'd accomplished. That recognition brought unexpected opportunities. The State University's Agriculture Department asked me to speak at their Beginning Farmer Conference. A regional magazine wanted to do a feature story about women in agriculture. The local farm bureau invited me to join their board of directors. Each invitation was validation that I'd moved beyond being an experiment or curiosity. I was being recognized as a legitimate voice in agricultural circles, someone whose opinions and experiences had value beyond their novelty. The magazine interview was particularly meaningful. The reporter asked about overcoming challenges and proving myself in a traditionally male-dominated field. I found myself talking about the difference between helping build someone else's dream and creating your own legacy. I spent years being incredibly skilled at supporting other people's visions, I explained. Learning to trust my own judgment and take full responsibility for success or failure was actually more difficult than managing the land or the livestock. The article ran with photos of me feeding cattle at sunrise and tending vegetables in the golden evening light. My phone rang for days afterward with calls from other women interested in starting agricultural operations. Some wanted advice, others just wanted to share their own stories of fighting for recognition in family farming operations. I realized I'd inadvertently become a symbol of something larger than my personal success. Women throughout rural America were watching to see if the farmer's daughter could succeed independently, right next door to the family operation that hadn't chosen her as heir. 1 year after buying the farm, I hosted Thanksgiving dinner for the first time. Jake and Martha came, along with several neighbors who'd become true friends rather than curious observers. The table was crowded with dishes made from ingredients grown on my land. Turkey I'd raised myself, vegetables from my garden, preserves from my fruit trees. Looking around that table, I realized I'd created exactly what I'd hoped for when I signed those loan papers. Not just a successful farming operation, but a life that felt authentically mine. The loneliness of my first night in the house had been replaced by deep satisfaction and genuine community connections. Jake raised his glass for a toast. To Sarah, who showed us all that sometimes the best inheritance is the one you create yourself. The words brought tears to my eyes, not just for their kindness but for the journey they acknowledged. I'd started this venture to prove something to my family and community, but somewhere along the way, it had become about proving something to myself. Standing later on my front porch, looking across the fence line toward the family ranch where Jake was building his own version of our parents' dream, I felt complete. We'd both found our paths, both honored our heritage while creating our own legacies. The land stretched out before me in the moonlight. My land, earned through courage rather than birthright, developed through innovation rather than tradition. It was exactly the inheritance I'd needed, even if it wasn't the one I'd expected. Sometimes the best gifts are the ones we give ourselves. Thank you so much for listening to my story. It means the world to me that you took the time to hear about this journey from heartbreak to hope. I'd love to know where you're listening from. Please leave a comment telling me what part of the world you call home. And if this story resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. There are so many more stories to share about the courage it takes to build the life you really want.